Good evening. My name is Solveig Nicklos, and I'm the Director of Leadership at Misk. It is my pleasure to be the moderator for tonight's event on this very important subject of transitioning from the private to the public sector. Misk is very excited about the research we have recently done with the Center for Creative Leadership on this topic, and the report on the private to public transition should inform the public discourse on this increasingly relevant topic and will be the focus of our conversation here tonight. I'm delighted to welcome our panelists who are the two co-authors of this study, as well as a key contributor who himself has gone through such a transition. Dr. Bandar AlHejin is currently Director of Career Development at the Misk Foundation. Career development aims to enable job readiness through cutting-edge, career-focused educational experiences delivered by leading professional educators with proven track records in career advancement and employability in current and emerging sectors. Prior to Misk, Dr. Bandar was an associate professor of discourse analysis and director of the Future Leadership Training Department in the Center for the Development of Administrative Leadership at the Institute of Public Administration in Riyadh. At IPA, Dr. Bandar was leading their NTP 2020 leadership initiative from inception to delivery. Bandar has 29 years of international experience living in the UK, US, Austria, and Jordan, and is fluent in Arabic, English, and German. He holds a PhD in Applied Linguistics from Lancaster University, a Master's of Arts and Master's of Education in Applied Linguistics from Columbia University, and a Bachelor in International Relations, Organizations, and Law from Georgetown University. Dr. Jennifer Martineau was Senior Vice President, Research, Evaluation, and Societal Advancement at the Center of Creative Leadership. Dr. Jennifer is the president and founder of Leap and Inspire Global LLC, an organization focused on helping individuals and organizations achieve their full potential through coaching, consulting, and development. Jennifer's passion is in helping organizations do the hard work required to become inclusive and equitable, and helping individuals in traditionally underrepresented groups identify and break through the barriers they confront in their leadership journeys. Prior to forming Leap and Inspire Group, Jennifer was Senior Vice President of Research, Evaluation, and Societal Advancement at CCL. And in her over 26 years experience there, she contributed to the growth through her evidence-based focus on evaluation, design, facilitation, coaching, writing, and speaking. She's recently co-authored a book with Portia R. Mount called Kick Some Glass, 10 Ways Women Succeed at Work on Their Own Terms. Jennifer holds a PhD in Industrial Organizational Psychology from Pennsylvania State University, is a TEDx speaker and frequent keynote speaker, and has appeared on Channel News Asia. Finally, our last panelist is Hazim Al-Hazmi, Chief Strategy Officer at the Saudi Tourism Authority. Hazim transitioned from private sector to the public sector in late 2017. Prior to his transition, Hazim worked in the private sector companies such as Procter & Gamble, Goody, and Savola Group. His first position in the public sector was as general manager with the Ministry of Labor and Social Development. Then he served as an advisor to His Excellency, the Vice Minister of Economy and Planning, before joining the Saudi Tourism Authority in early 2020. He was a participant in the Misk Foundation and CCL study of Saudi leaders' private to public sector transitions. Welcome to all of you. That was an incredibly impressive introduction. I'm excited to be with you here tonight.
Thank you very much, Solveig, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm super excited to be here to launch this all-important paper, which we worked very hard on, and I want to thank all, including Dr. Jennifer and Hazim and everybody else who participated in this and making this study a reality and took the time to speak to us to bring it out to light. So thank you everybody very much, and very excited to be here finally to announce this paper to the world.
It has indeed been a long time coming. It is certainly my pleasure to be speaking to you. Before we get started, I do want to encourage the audience to participate and engage with us. There is a Q&A box, so please put your questions in that, and they will get to me throughout the discussion. I will weave them into our conversation, and we will have an additional dedicated time at the end. I also encourage everyone to stay tuned until the very end, as we will be announcing exciting details about the report itself. So if I may, let's jump in. Dr. Bandar, if I could ask you to lead off with what was the inspiration for writing this report and what is it about?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, salatu salam ala Rasulullah. So the inspiration for this study, or the initial, I think, spark for the idea in my mind, if I kind of had to go back to 2016, I was planning a trip to the desert, which I usually do once a year. And one of our directors, I remember distinctly, called me and said, and they knew that I was leaving for a week or so. And he said, look, you're just going to have to postpone your trip, because we have this gathering for different teams at the Al-Hazmi hotel. So we had been hearing things about that the weeks prior, about what was called the National Transformation Program 2020. And this was 2016, when those ideas were still being cooked at Al-Hazmi, which was basically a hotel that had been converted into a big kitchen for the National Transformation Program ideas to be developed. And all the government entities were represented under that roof. It was an amazing experiment, and we were changing and learning things every day. Obviously, as soon as I arrived there, I soon sort of forgot about my desert trip and realized what an amazing opportunity this was going to be to represent, at the time, IPA and the team for a number of initiatives that each government entity would be running for the purposes of really causing and leading to the transformation that would eventually lead to the Vision 2030 goals. One of the things that I realized in my daily interactions in that place, and there was, you had the government employees, you had a lot of consultants, which was, to be expected, because you needed the brain power, but you also had young men like Hazim here, who I hadn't interacted with before, a different breed of people who were coming from the private sector, and their way of thinking, their way of holding meetings, their way of running things. Obviously, I was very much the product of the government sector. I'd been there at the time for some 15 odd years. So I was very much used to that culture. But from those days, there was a realization that there's a large number of people who had been recruited from the private sector to join the efforts of this transformation as part of the strategy to introduce a new mindset. And it made perfect sense. It also really helped the private and public sector sort of the private-public sector cooperation, which is also a big part of what the vision was trying to achieve. And since those days, looking at all those people in those meetings, in those rooms, and thereafter, you'd see that there's this phenomenon of this large number of leaders being recruited, and logically, there's a very different culture between the environments that they reside in before they made that transition to the public sector. And this was just in the beginnings of the vision programs and the NTP, and thereafter, as the more we interacted with government entities, and the more we see this happening across different government bodies, it was clearly a phenomenon I think was worth examining. What are the challenges? There must be some challenges as you make that transition, since it is such a different environment, and what what are the lessons learned from that, and how can we turn that into a piece of research that can benefit leaders who may be making that transition in the future as well. So that was kind of where the idea came from, because it's clearly one of the hallmarks or phenomena that we realize that accompanied the vision realization programs and everything else, and all the transformations that are happening in the country.
Thank you for that. And let me just make one quick comment. One of our audience members, Khalid, has put a question in, but he's put it in Arabic, and my Arabic is not yet that good. So I would request that all questions be in English, just simply for the purposes of this discussion, as it will be an Arabic discussion. But thank you, Dr. Bandar, for that. And I really appreciate it. And interesting that you mentioned the mindsets, and we'll get back to that a little bit later. But let me jump to Dr. Jennifer, actually, if I can ask you, what are some of the, in the research, as we began, what are some of the key reasons that you found that private sector leaders are joining the public sector?
Thank you, Solveig. There were really two key reasons that people are making that transition from the private to the public sector. And by far the most popular one, the most frequently described reason was just the excitement around Vision 2030 and wanting to be a part of something so significant for the country of Saudi Arabia, wanting to contribute and have impact on the country and on the people. So there was I hope that when I speak about it, you can hear some of that excitement that we heard, that Bandar and I heard as we were interviewing people, because that was so present. There was I don't know if pride is the right word to say, but just a joy that people were bringing into joining the public sector. The other key reason is that people were seeing it as a place where they could grow and develop. And this was perhaps counterintuitive to what people might expect that we would have found. That with the stereotypes of what it's like to work in private industry and what it's like to work in the public sector. But really, people were saying that they're able to grow and develop in ways in the public sector that they had not found, or they found different anyway, than in the private sector. And so they were seeing it not only as a way for them to contribute to the country, but as a way for them to grow and develop as individuals, as leaders, and to be able to make some difference in their own lives as well.
I have to say having been in the region now for 10 years, I've been incredibly motivated and excited by many of the visions and the plans, but the Vision 2030 is uniquely inspirational in my mind. And so I share your enthusiasm for it. Now, if I could jump to Hazim, I mean, you're one of the people who has made this transition. So how did you, one, participate in this report specifically, but what was your reason for making such a transition?
So for the first part, and actually before talking about the first part, I'd really like to thank everyone who's worked on this study. I think it came on the right time, giving guidance to those who intend or thought or had already made this transition, and that is the insights that would come out of such a report would be really useful for people to set the right expectations. And I think that is a big reason for success. So I got approached by Dr. Bandar, being an alumni of the executive leadership program that Misk conducted a while ago. And he briefed me about the study and the objectives, and being someone who's very passionate about sharing knowledge and contributing to fostering the next generation of leaders, it was definitely an opportunity for me to contribute and serve from that perspective. For the second part, and why did I make the transition from private to public sector, to confirm what Dr. Jennifer said, I personally come from a family that has served the flag and served the country in different posts. My father is a retired general in the police force. My uncles, my cousins, a lot of them come from very different military organizations in Saudi. I personally chose a career that is business driven, and I did that for my studies and my private sector experience. And a few years back, when the vision happened, it was really inspirational. Having a massive paradigm transformational program that would truly change the economic value creation paradigm of Saudi was something that I wanted to be part of. When the right opportunity came, I jumped right onto it, and yeah, I've been doing that for the past 3 years.
I mean, obviously you have been doing it longer than I have, but I understand that moment of enthusiasm when you had the opportunity to jump on it. So I look forward to talking about that a little more. But let me, for a moment, focus on this study. I know from previous webinars, I'm sure we have a few academics in the audience. And so if I could ask Dr. Bandar or Dr. Jennifer to talk a little bit about the methodology of the report itself. How many people participated, a little bit about the quantitative findings, because I know our academics get very excited about that.
Yes, we do, don't we? So the study was made up with interviews of 21 individuals who had made that transition from the private to the public sector, both men and women. And then we followed up with a survey to people who had made that similar transition and had responses from 176 of those. So of those, we had 132 men and 44 women participate in the survey itself. And we also looked at some of the data according to when they joined the public sector. Was it before Vision 2030 was announced, or was it after? And so we had in our pool of survey respondents, we had 70 who joined before 2016, and 100 that joined, that told us that they joined, you know, in 2016 or somewhat after that. So it was a kind of a good mix of people who came in before the announcements were made and people who are coming in then after and being drawn to it, and a mix of both men and women. Dr. Bandar, what else would you add about the study methodology or the quantitative findings?
Maybe something I forgot to mention here was that one of the reasons we, Misk, decided to partner with the Center for Creative Leadership is that the center, obviously CCL, is a world famous organization that is obviously very well known in the leadership development and executive education field, but not just that, but they also, 50% of what they do is also very much focused on research. And that's one of the things we really like about the culture of CCL. And they have 50+ years experience in that field, also in both public and private sector research. So that's one of the reasons we felt that Misk felt that CCL was the right partner for this. And again, we had, I think it was an amazing journey for me and Jennifer. I would just say that the product of this, basically, this kind of the triangulation of the interviews and then confirming what was happening in the interviews through the quantitative data gave us a way of validating that our assumptions were correct. And the outcome was basically a white paper, which inshallah tonight will be released and announced and published immediately after the seminar, is that we examined the key challenges that leaders were basically facing. And then we also considered what are the sort of the key skill sets that current leaders are recommended to have, especially in their first sort of 100 days of being on the job, because there's not much time. If there's one thing that we learned from these interviews is that you have to kind of hit the ground running. So again, the paper was written to be very practical in mind, and so that the reader can very quickly see some lessons learned without going too much into sort of theory and stuff like that. And we also examine the factors that typically cause people to derail, as it were. What are the kind of the mistakes that you make that you wish you had known, somebody would have told you to avoid when you were first making your transition. And finally, we came up with some recommendations, both for the organizations and also kind of quick tips on the individual level for people who are who just made the transition or about to make that transition. That's basically how we've structured the paper, and we hope that that really maximizes the impact.
And we'll be talking through actually many of those points as we go through, and so kind of now that we have the context and a bit of the history of how it was put together, Hazim, I want to jump to you and talk to set the stage. What do you see as the key differences as someone who's gone through this transition between the public and private sector and the challenges that people face in doing that?
So based on my experience, I would package my answer into three inherent differences between working for private or public sector institutions. One is the business environment, the second one is the cycle of impact, and the third one is purpose and fulfillment. So in terms of business environment, private sector, more often than not, is more institutionalized. It is much more, it has a structured approach on how to do value creation. There are very standardized operating models and procedures. And with that comes very clear roles and responsibilities. Today, the government is undergoing a massive macro level transformational program. And in transformational environments, sometimes things are a little bit volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Sometimes there are questions without answers. Sometimes lines of value creation are not so aligned. And the whole thesis of this vision program is to align those and to reach a better ambitioned future. So my advice there, and for people who are either undergoing this transition or thinking to make that move, is to really consider it like a massive transformational program. So invest more on communication and aligning expectations. Don't seek perfection on the expense of productivity. The 80-20 rule is golden here. And it's very important to balance between the future long-term outlook and achieving short-term goals as well. So this is the first main difference that I've seen. The second one is related to the cycle of impact. In the corporate world or in the private sector, we are used to annual cycles that are then broken down to quarterly cycles, whereby you have the year results, your profit target, your market share targets, and everything else. These targets are much more tangible and much more realizable in the shorter term. When we are here in public sector, the impact is on a macro level. So that takes more time. And one who is very used to that euphoria of success and scoring a goal every quarter or achieving that quarterly target, one needs to adjust their expectations on what success looks like and the cycle of impact. Some of the things you work on today, legislative changes, policy making, infrastructural investments, would sometime realize the results within a span of 3 years or even more. And one needs to adjust that. And my advice there is for people to really set the right expectations with themselves and with their teams, is to create a culture that celebrates effort as much as it celebrates results, and to really ensure that again, communication is key here. The third and last theme, honestly, talks about the power of purpose. You know, when you're in private sector, you are there to achieve the bottom line, the profits. You are there to achieve the market share. And as you do that within your career, you grow. You grow in title, you grow in pay. In public sector today, you achieve all the above. And in addition to that, again, to Jennifer's point, that higher order benefit on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you know, it really fulfills you up there. Being there and contributing to something that is bigger than yourself, contributing to a better future for next generation and for one's kids to grow up in a much better environment that one grew up in, is something that is very fulfilling from a purpose perspective. That's truly is the fuel that makes you wake up every day in the morning, roll up your sleeves, and try to go and tackle those challenges. So this is my experience in a nutshell.
If I can ask you a follow-up to that, we have a very active audience member asking a question, and specifically directed one to you. He mentions that your description of the transformation that the public sector is going through sounds like an environment of a startup or a fast-growing unicorn, is the analogy he used. So should it be surprising that the roles, processes, approaches may be not well defined? Is that a good way of thinking about it? So thank you for your question.
I think I would confirm that. It is honestly a hybrid between a startup and an organization that is older but undergoing transformation. There are symptoms of such environments that we've seen in private sector organizations. I personally has undergone through organizational transformations, and I've worked for startups before in private sector. And there are traces of that in what is happening in the public sector today.
Now, if I could jump, Dr. Bandar, to, you know, I'm the director of leadership, so this is something that's very close to my heart. And the idea of people who are making these transitions, based on the report and the study, the data that we found, what sort of leadership skills do they need to have and or develop to make it a smoother transition?
Thank you, Solveig. I think one thing I'd like to sort of maybe just take a step back is to maybe address also the kind of the challenges involved in this, because there's the way we kind of sequenced this was to sort of consider the challenges and consider also what skills you need in order to confront those challenges. So if I may, I'd like to just sort of start there first. There were a number of challenges, which I think also segue nicely from what Hazim was just mentioning in terms of, or maybe if there's a couple of, around 5 that we mentioned in the paper, one being the kind of high level of bureaucracy, which surprises people coming from the private sector to some extent. there are extensive processes, policies, and procedures, and the kind of things that maybe somebody from the private sector just simply didn't have to deal with. It's not a question of being competency. It's just something that may not have been as relevant. And then you have simple examples that may sound trivial, but again, I'm a linguist by training, so I always come back to these kind of things. That communication is so important. And it's, believe it or not, many of the people we interviewed were a little bit hampered by having to use, going back to using formal Arabic in their emails versus just sort of shooting the quick email to ask a question, even if it is in Arabic. But as you know, the formality of things is a little bit more pronounced in the public sector. So that was actually one of the interesting things that came up more than once, where people kind of had to relearn or rely on somebody else, believe it or not, to kind of make sure that their communication is going out in the right way, which, as you can imagine, adds sort of an additional sort of overhead in terms of time. And just getting sort of approvals from different levels in the government hierarchy. These are kind of things that maybe surprised people coming in who are ready to hit the ground running, have that excitement, but maybe need to be mentally prepared to cope with that kind of let's say some level of bureaucracy. Although I do have some interesting exceptions, which I think I'd like to mention later on in the webinar. We'll come back to that. Also, kind of just the sheer scale of things. You're talking about massive government projects, which with serious consequences. So, and it also goes into sort of deep organizational levels and complexities with projects, especially the NTP project, which often involves coordination amongst different government entities, and kind of the patience that goes into running that kind of, those kind of projects across those different entities. It can be overwhelming. And even things like obtaining the necessary data. You want to make your decisions. You want your decisions to be data driven, and accessing that data isn't always as straightforward as you might expect, as there are some hurdles there. And also just sort of having it, another maybe characteristic was the sort of difference in organizational culture, where maybe no decision is preferable to the wrong decision. So there's kind of a risk averseness that is a characteristic of and again, I don't want to generalize to all government entities, and I'll have a point about that later on. There is quite some diversity there, but that's generally one of the things that came up, in addition to what we call al-mujamala, or basically accepting something out of politeness. Sometimes we do that on purpose. Sometimes we do it because we are forced to do so based on maybe other considerations. But that kind of culture is maybe something that is foreign to somebody who is coming from a more corporate structure. Also, kind of the legacy government employees might have kind of an us versus them maybe dynamic, with incoming hot shots coming in from the private sector who are know a lot about different things, but maybe don't know everything, and they don't. So they need to be careful as well about not putting themselves above the people that they are going to lead. And indeed, that's again something else that I think new leaders need to take into account as they come in. Also, maybe another point was shifting priorities. So because sometimes ministers change and then strategies change, so that kind of flux and turbulence sort of changes maybe things that in a corporate organization would remain constant and are more set according to certain structural systems that are in the company or in the organization. Whereas in the public sector, things can change dramatically based on leadership changes. And those are all kinds of things that people coming in to executive positions have to maneuver and navigate very carefully. Finally, maybe there was another challenge, which is competing over talent. Now, in the past, working for the government was, as Hazim mentioned, is an honorable thing to do, and the attractiveness of holding a position in government was and remains to be an important point of pride. But at the same time, people who were looking for experience or being challenged maybe would actually, in the past, not go to the public sector, but actually go to the private sector, because that's where you're going to have more of that scrutiny and the work and the let's say the culture was a little bit more geared towards productivity and the bottom line, whereas things may have been a little bit more lax in the older, or let's say the stereotypical perception of what how people work in the government. All of that has changed dramatically. So now there is actually some competition over people coming into the private sector in terms of really sourcing the right talent, and that presents also its own challenges, because there's human talent is a finite thing, and there is a large sense of competition, and the recruitment mechanisms, the current recruitment mechanisms in the public sector are still complex and not very flexible. So for you to bring in the talent that you want is a little bit more difficult when you're talking about your staff level recruitment. Those are some of the challenges that came to mind. Maybe, I don't know if Jennifer, you have some other points that I might have missed.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Bandar. I do want to share that, as you talk about these challenges that we heard about, these weren't coming just from a few people. So the challenge of the bureaucracy that people were having to become accustomed to and learn how to work in was actually shared by about 70% of the people who we interviewed and or through the survey. So it's a very significant number of people in the group of people who are making the transition. And then with each of the other challenges that you've talked about, they were faced by anywhere from about 36 to about 41% of the people who we spoke with. So these are significant challenges that are not unique to just one or two people. They are really something that as you get into talking about skill sets needed and then how to support people in building those skill sets, it's important to realize that this is for the entire pool of people who are making that transition, and not just for a small percentage of them.
Now, if I could just, before we move on to the skill sets, because of course that's my next logical question, and the leadership skills and the skill sets, but one of the audience members did mention their experience with unspoken political networks and the impact that and that they're not as prevalent in their statement as in the public sector, but is deeply rooted. They're not as prevalent in the private sector, but deeply rooted in the public sector. And what advice would you share for someone dealing with that?
Yeah, we heard quite a bit of that in terms of, the complexity. Bandar talked about the complexity of the situation, very large projects. It's also that you've got a very diverse group of stakeholders that you need to learn how to work with, but also understand who the named people are in that network, in that group of influencers, and also who the unnamed people are. And so those we call them kind of invisible people in the network, invisible influencers, can have a huge impact on the success of the work that we're doing. So we certainly did hear that people were having to spend time getting to know that as part of the complexity that they were learning.
I believe the question related to the kind of the skill sets that we want leaders to maybe focus on in their first 100 days, kind of if that's where, because there was just a bit of a choppy connection here. So why don't I just take that question, and please, Jennifer and also Hazim, feel free to just sort of jump in at any point. So in terms of the kind of the skill sets, we kind of put it into like what would be the priority for you in your first 100 days, but maybe there's just two things, maybe observations or insights to consider here, which is that when we talk about these skill sets, when you hear what they are sort of at a high level, those kind of skill sets are really important in most sectors. They're not unique to the public sector. It's not like you need communication skills here, but you don't need them there. It doesn't work that way. But it's about how you employ those skills. So there are, when you talk about also leaders transitioning from the private to the public sector, you'll see that there are certain nuances that they need to be aware of in those skill sets, which may sound commonplace and well known, but need to be sort of unpacked to see, okay, so how do I communicate with my colleagues when I'm in a public sector sort of situation, and what the differences are. The second maybe observation is that you want to, and I mentioned this earlier, you want to pretty much hit the ground running and sort of get ready before you're even hired in many of these positions, because the expectation is that you're going to move very fast. So you don't have the luxury of time, and hence this is our modest attempt to support leaders in those positions, making those transitions. And maybe we could summarize them in sort of 8 sort of skill sets. One is, and this was most prevalent based on the survey and also in our interviews, was obviously change management. Change management was an important point that came up again and again. And obviously that it's a complex sort of set of skills that you need for that in order to deliver that kind of, that's a whole, you could say that's a science in and of itself, but it's clearly something that is required now from leaders who are honestly coming into organizations to affect change. That's the expectation. That's why you're being brought into this organization. Mindset change and organizational change. So that's obviously was top of mind. Again, guys, feel free to jump in if there's something that you'd want to add to that. The second was direction setting. And by that, we mean basically the why of what we're doing. Because if you're going to build your team and you want to make that change management work, you really need to make a strong, compelling case, a passionate case, something that speaks to the heart of your employees, whether it's the legacy employees or the people that you're recruiting, to bring them all on board and understand kind of what the values are here, or what are the values that we're trying to adhere to here to make that change. So that's absolutely not to be underestimated. In third place was strategy execution. Obviously, there's a whole set of skills that relates to, once you have those beautiful plans, how do you actually translate those into actionable projects that can actually be delivered? Communication was key. We mentioned this before. Maybe, if I'm the way I send an email if I want to make a request, or maybe it's a better idea for me to go across the hall to my colleague's office, sit down, have a glass of tea, and discuss other things before I get to this point, and actually do some kind of, let's say, scene setting instead of sending a cold email about something that we've never talked about before. Little things like that can go a long way as part of what we put under sort of communication skills. Decision making needs to happen relatively quickly, and there's obviously an urgency to do so, because yes, it's a risk-averse culture, but at the same time, you want to disrupt, but you want to disrupt gently, and you want to do it in a way that doesn't, let's say, cause too much disruption, if I can put it gently. Also, leading teams. Leading teams is a key part of this, developing the people around you, having regular meetings with your teams, especially the juniors who may, are trying to grow, and the ones that you as a leader are trying to sort of, set a good example for as future leaders. Political savvy has to be there as well. You shouldn't be naive about the environment that you're in. Very interesting that, again, in today's world versus maybe in the past, just being very aware of what's happening on social media platforms will take you a long way to make sure that you're very much aware of what is happening in the larger environment and not being naive about that. And also, again, interpersonal savvy and being able to speak to each of because there's so many different stakeholders that you're dealing with in and outside of your organization, and having the skill to be able to communicate which one of them in the way that basically sparks their interest and gets them engaged with the goals that you're trying to achieve. That's just kind of a quick run through of some of the skills that we would recommend people focus on in the first 100 days.
Thank you very much, because of course that's really the guts of what everyone is hoping to get out, is how can they apply the information we've learned. My apologies to our audience for my technical glitch a moment ago. But to that point, Hazim, I have 2 points. One, of that list, what have you found that resonates with what your experience is? And one of our audience member, Abdulaziz, has a question that is unique, would be maybe unique in your skill set of, my question, from him is, for who should people start their career in the private sector before they move into the public sector? Based on now that is of course how you've done it, but is that your recommendation to get both of those experiences?
All right, so for the first part, definitely what Dr. Bandar said resonates a lot. I would like to stress on a few of these, if I may. So I believe that the skill set that is needed, first, you need a foundation of technical knowledge in your subject matter expertise. That will give you the legitimacy to be able to influence socially. It will give you the legitimacy and the right to drive results and lead within the environment you're at. Topping that technical expertise and technical knowledge with social and savviness and emotional intelligence is definitely a must in such environment. It's as important, as much as smart, as much as you are smart, as much as you're technically capable, you need to be able to play the right social game. And you need to also focus on results, because the last thing we want in this environment are people who talk without walking. So I would like to stress on these 3 points. Now, to the second part and to the question being asked, again, it depends. It depends. So today we have a few hundred government organizations in Saudi, by the way. Ministries, vision realization programs, commissions, authorities, centers, and these vary in terms of level of maturity and environment that fosters learning and development. So I guess it depends. And honestly, the skill set that you earn in private sector versus public sector differ a bit. So I think it all depends on appetite, on your risk averseness, and what you want to be eventually. One would ideally look into a desired future and say, well, what do I need to do now, or what skill set do I need to acquire now to be able to reach that desired future? And there are so many options within private and public sector.
Thank you very much. Now, we've talked about, the challenges, obstacles. We've talked about the key skills, both, from the aggregate research and then from personal experience. And Dr. Jennifer, I want to throw it, and we have a question from the audience, which very much flows from that, which is, what are some of the, the key or the 3 biggest derailers? What are the things that people bring, the baggage that people bring with them that does not help them in this transition?
Yeah, it's a great question. We looked in the research for particular indicators of those derailers that the Center for Creative Leadership has done research on and has identified multiple times over the past 40 years. And we found all of those, and so I'll talk about those. But one in particular that we found that was unique, perhaps, in this situation, it was new to that set of derailers, is lack of patience. And to Hazim's point, when you are coming from the private sector and you are accustomed to quarterly measures and projects turning over quickly and feeling the rewards of what it is you've been doing, it simply takes longer to achieve those milestones when you're talking about a large government system. And so what we heard from people was that when they're not receiving the praise and the reinforcement that they're accustomed to receiving on those short-term quarterly kind of bases, it can be frustrating. And so that lack of patience is something people need to be aware of and be mindful of, and be ready to counteract when they feel like they're running into it. The other aspects of derailment, one is difficulty changing and adapting. Clearly, you're moving from one environment into a very different environment. And so when you do that, someone needs to be able to adjust to new processes, new ways in which your leadership operates, and that kind of thing. And so you've got to be able to change and be agile in order to make that kind of transition. A third derailer, as we call them, is problems with interpersonal relationships. And we did hear this. And one of the examples that I would share is that from someone that we interviewed said, somebody that I knew came into a situation and just had the wrong boss. They couldn't get along. And so whether it was the wrong boss or not, it's that issue of not being able to work effectively with the team around you that is certainly a career staller. Now, Bandar talked about something that's important from a skill set perspective, which is leading teams. And so on the flip side, a derailer is difficulty in building and leading that team. And one of the specific challenges that we were hearing coming up that illustrated this derailer is, when I come in to lead a part of the public sector, I have people on my team who have been in that sector, in that ministry for quite some time. And I have new people coming in from the private sector, and I have to figure out how to bring them together and help them work effectively as a team. And if I can't do that, then it makes it hard for us to get our work done. And then finally, to Hazim, to your point, being results oriented, you've got to be able to meet business objectives. And so if you fail to meet those business objectives, that certainly is going to be a derailer. So that was what we found. Very interesting, particularly that the addition of the lack of patience in this group.
Now, if I could, kind of a continuation from this, because we've now talked kind of the three major buckets of research findings in the work that we've done. And we have, again, from the audience asking, Dr. Jennifer, what may be the similarities and differences in the findings of this research in Saudi versus similar research that we might have seen in projects globally?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And we did take a look at that. And there's actually some, trying to find that particular note, there is some overlap. And so the Center for Creative Leadership did a study in 2016 of 5,000 government civilian leaders and found that the 5 most important leadership characteristics were personal leadership, managing and motivating subordinates, operational organizational performance, talent management, and boundary spanning. So that's working across different boundaries and entities and working with different stakeholders. So there really is a good bit of similarity there. But I think that what we were hearing would draw a distinction in that the Saudi leaders who have made that transition from private to public had more emphasis than the global study did on strategy execution, interpersonal savvy, political savvy, and change management. So while there are some similarities, there were also some particular areas that stood out differently. And let me name them again: strategy execution, interpersonal savvy, political savvy, and change management that came out for the people that we surveyed and interviewed.
Now, I'm curious to taking, the context of what you just said and the different areas, both in KSA and globally, jumping back to Hazim for a second, you've now been in the government for, I think you said 3 years.
Yep.
And the Vision 2030, of course, has been an initiative that's been going on longer than that and has a much longer horizon in front of us. I'm curious if you've seen in your tenure now with the government, how have you seen the culture shift? How have you seen some of these issues evolve and develop?
Well, honestly, I could speak for the 3 years, and I'm sure that they are along the same trend. There is change, tangible change that is happening. There was indeed a stereotypical symptom of public sector, being complacent, things are slow, bureaucratic, silos, all the classic symptoms of classic public sector. I think the vision came in and ignited a big change. And that change was inspirational for a certain type of caliber to enter public sector. And there is a network effect to that. The more people come and as skin changes, you see a more agile environment, more government entities are competing actually to achieve results and meet expectations of the leadership. And cross-organizational collaboration and communication is really happening more often than before. I believe this trend will continue, and with the continuous push and expectations from up there, I believe that we do have a big chance to achieve our desired ambition.
Thank you. And then with that, and that momentum and that enthusiasm that you're describing and that change, Dr. Bandar, if I could jump to you, what can organizations specifically do to support these leaders in transition? What's next? How can we apply and benefit from this study?
Yeah, I'm very happy to address that point, but I do want to add one more thing to what Hazim is talking about, which is the fact, I think the fact that His Royal Highness Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was himself 30 years old when he conceived of Vision 2030 program at that time. The impact of that has been so profound in empowering and inspiring a new, younger breed of leaders in key government positions. I mentioned when I was in that building, there were younger people than I was used to leading these workshops and getting the NTP program going at the time. And you could tell that there was a difference in culture. And that I think has been a major source of inspiration for all of us and has had profound impact on the sort of cultural and also the sort of the organizational changes that Hazim was talking about. I'd like to also add that even sort of on talking about classic government versus traditional, I'm just reminded of a quote from Hind Zahed, the Deputy Minister of Women's Empowerment at the Ministry of Human Resources and Social Development. She had a memorable quote, which we put in the study, was that I thought that I would face a very rigid ministry with classic government. I was very surprised. Everything is moving fast, she said. So you could tell that this cultural change was already and is already happening. And another observation I want to just add here is that there's no sort of single monolithic culture in the public sector. When Jennifer and I went from one ministry or one commission to the next, we were encountering very different environments and institutions at different stages of their transformation. So it also doesn't do justice for us to say that all public sector, entities are this way. There are newer also, especially the entities that were born out of the Vision 2030 programs. These entities such as ADA and the General Authority for Small Medium Enterprises, Munsha'at, and the General Entertainment Authority and others all have already a very sort of a different culture than, let's say, more traditional classic government entities. But to your question, I think that in our research, organizations may want to bring new government joiners from different entities together to build a relationship of networks. They may want to give new leaders onboarding package. And again, this was really something that came up again and again to all the leaders we spoke to. They said, we wish that there had been some kind of orientation program for us. And that's, again, something I hope that Misk can contribute to through the leadership programs, which we are doing as well going forward, inshallah, so that there's some kind of onboarding and providing guidance to help new leaders understand the ecosystem within the government, create maybe shadowing and mentoring programs prior to joining, provide sufficient orientation, as we mentioned, and also creating better systems of support for leaders to assess talent for succession and development processes. On a more personal level, I think when we sort of go to, not from the organizational, but also just sort of, if you will, quick tips for leaders, I would say that it kind of revolved around a couple of main themes. One was communicating effectively, okay? Aim to meet in person first, avoid starting non-conventional requests in an email, learn how to present something to your minister convincingly in 5 minutes. Under leading and developing other employees, you should actively recognize and never underestimate the value of so-called legacy employees. Many of them actually possess talent that has not been allocated in the right place, so don't underestimate them. Disrupt gently while respecting the organizational culture. Think twice before replacing people in leadership positions. In the absence of systematic data and knowledge management, Those people are often indispensable source of experience. And for challenging projects, don't start by selecting the team members. Instead, announce the project and see who wants to volunteer and join. Hiring superstars is not always the best recruitment strategy. They're more likely to derail and be impatient. Try finding hardworking people that are hungry to learn and develop. They tend to be more resilient. On managing effectively, be prepared to build processes, involve change-resistant employees once operations are up and running. Try to institutionalize these processes to ensure that there's continuity even after you leave the organization. And just kind of be with your boss and your ministers, be aware of what kind of the real KPIs are and focus on those going forward. There's others, but I think we're running out of time, so I'll leave it there. Now, this is, again, I would emphasize a good point for me to mention. Details are in this paper. Please go have a look, and a lot of things that we had to kind of skim over today in this short 1 hour session are very much detailed in this paper, which is going to be published in the next 5 minutes.
Well, and with that, like you said, we've been running out of time. I thank the audience. I've tried to embed a number of their questions into our discussion, and we really appreciate and encourage their engagement. In fact, just so the panelists is aware, there were follow-up questions to the things that you answered to them, and unfortunately, we will not be able to get to. There were a number of very complimentary comments, and we greatly appreciate that level of engagement. We are very pleased to announce that the Misk CCL study is being published literally even as we speak. If you go to misk.org/sa/en private to public transitions en, all of this will be in the chat, so you can click on the link. My reading it is just going to confuse people, but it will be there in English and in Arabic. So for our audience who have requested the data, that it will all be available with these recommendations. I want to thank so much our panelists tonight, Dr. Bandar AlHejin, Hazim Al-Hazmi, and Dr. Jennifer Martineau for their time, both in contributing to the document itself, writing it, and then of course the discussion here tonight. We hope the audience will engage with us for future events, and we will continue to try to make sure that we at Misk with CCL and other partners engage with research that is very impactful in the development of the Vision 2030 and all of the future projects in KSA. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Solveig. Thank you, Hazim. Thank you, Bandar.
Thank you, Hazim. Thank you, Jennifer and Solveig, and everybody who participated in this. And thank you, everybody who attended tonight. It's a pleasure to have you, and please do have a look at this paper and spread it wide to all your friends and colleagues. There's a copy in English and Arabic. So ya'atikum al-afia, we'll see you soon, inshallah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.